What if I told you there was once a king so disfigured, so tragically broken in body and mind, that his own people believed he was cursed by the devil? Meet Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose face was so unsettling that even members of his own royal court whispered that he had to be bewitched. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. But here's the truth. Charles wasn't cursed by demons or dark magic. He was cursed by something far more dangerous, his own bloodline. This is the story of how Europe's most powerful dynasty slowly, deliberately, and catastrophically destroyed itself from the inside out, producing a king so damaged that when he finally died, his autopsy stunned the entire continent. If you're fascinated by the dark truths behind royal power, hit that subscribe button, because this story is just the beginning. 1. The jaw that couldn't close. When foreign ambassadors first met Charles II, many were stunned into silence. Imagine it. The king of one of the most powerful empires in the world standing before you, and he can't even close his mouth. His lower jaw jutted out so far that his lips couldn't meet. His mouth just hung open, constantly, like a door unhinged. It wasn't an injury. It wasn't a one-off birth defect. It was the end result of 2 centuries of intentional inbreeding. The Habsburg family, the ruling dynasty in Spain, had one guiding principle: keep power in the family. And that meant keeping marriages in the family too. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces over and over again. Charles's own parents, uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides, also uncle and niece. After generations of this, the royal gene pool was so shallow it was practically a puddle. Doctors today call the condition Charles had mandibular prognathism, but back then, everyone just called it the Habsburg jaw. Charles's jaw stuck out so severely that when he tried to close his mouth, there was still a visible gap, wide enough to slide a coin through. His upper and lower teeth didn't meet at all. In fact, his top row sat entirely behind the bottom row, making it almost impossible to chew food properly. And this wasn't just a cosmetic issue. Every single meal became an ordeal. Palace kitchens had to blend and mash his food into mush, like he was a toddler. Soups, broths, purees, anything solid was a risk. Even then, eating was messy. Liquids dribbled out of the sides of his mouth. Solid food sometimes just fell out entirely. Royal banquets, moments that were supposed to showcase majesty and dignity, turned into unsettling displays. Servants had to stand by constantly, dabbing the king's chin, wiping away saliva, food bits, and drips. And speaking, almost impossible. His disfigured jaw made his speech slurred and wet. Foreign envoys needed interpreters, not because they didn't speak Spanish, but because they couldn't understand the king through his garbled, mumbling words. Even his own advisors struggled to interpret him. Charles's mother, Queen Mariana, wrote letters expressing her deep fear that her son might one day choke on his own tongue in his sleep. Imagine that. The most powerful monarch in Europe, a man who ruled a global empire, was considered a choking hazard. And what's worse, the Habsburgs knew this was happening. They had records. They saw the increasing deformities in each generation. But they didn't stop. Because to them, maintaining pure royal blood was more important than the health or the survival of their children. By the time Charles was born, he wasn't just a sickly royal. He was living proof of what happens when human genetics go horribly, irreversibly wrong. 2. A body that defied nature. And the jaw? That was just the beginning. Charles's entire body was a disaster. At 35 years old, Charles didn't look like a king in the prime of his life. He looked like a sickly child who had been twisted and stretched by some cruel force. He stood barely 5 feet tall. His head was oversized, bobbing awkwardly on a neck that could barely support it. His limbs were long, thin, almost skeletal. His torso? Compressed and hunched, like someone had crushed him down into the wrong shape. Charles didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. 8. Most kids take their first steps around their first birthday. Charles spent nearly a decade unable to stand on his own 2 feet. And even when he did walk, it wasn't really walking. It was more like a stumble. He lurched from wall to wall, grabbing furniture to steady himself. His spine was so curved that he appeared permanently hunched over, as if he were carrying some invisible burden. And in a way, he was. Generations of genetic damage had come to rest on his narrow shoulders. The effects weren't just physical. Mentally, Charles remained at the level of a child well into adulthood. He didn't learn to read until he was 10, and even then, his tutors said it was nearly impossible to teach him. They described trying to educate him like trying to fill a cup full of holes. Nothing ever stuck. His emotions were just as unstable. Servants reported that he would throw tantrums over the smallest things, screaming and thrashing like a child denied candy. And then, just as suddenly, he'd fall into silence, sitting motionless for hours, staring into space. Even his hair betrayed his condition. It grew in thin, patchy tufts. It fell out in clumps. His scalp was said to resemble the hide of a diseased animal more than the head of a king. Court painters had no idea what to do. Their job was to make the king look strong, regal, impressive. But Charles gave them nothing to work with. Even the most flattering portraits couldn't fully hide the twisted figure he truly was. And the scariest part? He was getting worse. Most people hit physical maturity and plateau. Charles never did. His body kept deteriorating. Doctors were baffled. They had no idea what they were looking at. A man whose body was breaking down faster than they'd ever seen. A body that, quite literally, seemed to be falling apart from the inside out. 3. The king who couldn't make heirs. If the physical and mental devastation weren't enough, here's where Charles's story takes a turn from tragic to politically catastrophic. Because Charles II, king of the vast Spanish Empire, couldn't produce an heir. And for a royal dynasty, that's not just a personal issue. That's a full-blown national crisis. Charles was married not once, but twice. Both times with the desperate hope that he could father a child and continue the Habsburg line. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was a French princess. She arrived in Spain expecting a powerful royal husband, and instead found herself married to a man who many courtiers quietly said was barely human. The wedding night? A disaster. Servants later reported that Marie-Louise left the bedchamber in tears, and Charles looked just as confused and distressed. The truth was brutal. The same genetic collapse that had twisted his face and body had also left him sexually undeveloped. Doctors who examined him, in what must have been one of the most awkward and tragic jobs in European history, described his reproductive organs as infantile. To put it bluntly, Charles had the sexual maturity of a young child, trapped in a broken adult body. But the Spanish court couldn't say that out loud. They couldn't admit their king was incapable of doing the one thing a monarch absolutely had to do: make an heir. So instead, they turned on Marie-Louise. They blamed her. She was accused of being barren, a cruel and humiliating charge. Doctors poked and prodded her, prescribed awful herbal remedies, and subjected her to medieval fertility treatments. She was forced to drink disgusting concoctions, undergo invasive procedures, and live under the constant pressure of a court waiting for her to become pregnant, when everyone should have known the real problem was Charles. It took a massive toll. Marie-Louise, once described as lively and intelligent, grew withdrawn and deeply depressed. She turned to prayer, spending hours begging God for a miracle that was never coming. Some historians believe the stress, combined with those bizarre fertility treatments, slowly poisoned her. She died mysteriously at the age of just 26. And what did the court do? They immediately arranged another marriage. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a family known for having lots of children, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she could succeed where Marie-Louise had failed. But by this point, Charles was in his 30s, and his health had only worsened. Maria Anna would later write in private letters that she was horrified by her husband's condition, and quickly realized that producing an heir was impossible. Still, the court tried everything. They brought in doctors from across Europe. They scoured ancient fertility manuals. They even turned to magic. Yes, literal magic. Charles underwent humiliating treatments that included everything from sexual stimulants to whispered prayers. Physicians examined him endlessly, trying to find some hidden fix. Nothing worked, because the issue wasn't curable. It wasn't about his wife. It wasn't even about medicine. Charles's body was fundamentally broken at a genetic level. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe watched and waited. Everyone knew that if Charles died without a child, the Spanish throne would be up for grabs, and every major European power had some kind of claim. Tensions began to rise. Diplomats maneuvered. Armies were quietly positioned. The War of Spanish Succession was already smoldering in the shadows, just waiting for Charles to take his final breath. And here's the cruel irony. The Habsburgs had spent centuries obsessively intermarrying, trying to concentrate power and keep their bloodline pure. And in the end, their final king couldn't even do the one thing a royal was born to do. He couldn't reproduce. Their obsession with genetic purity had led to total biological failure. Fourth, exorcisms in the royal palace. As Charles's condition continued to decline, and as medicine failed to offer any answers, the Spanish court turned to something older, darker, and far more disturbing. Religion. Not just prayers and blessings, exorcisms. Full-on theatrical exorcisms performed inside the royal palace. The church's explanation was simple. Charles was possessed by demons, and if doctors couldn't fix him, maybe priests could. Father Froilan Diaz, the royal exorcist, declared that Charles had been overtaken by not one, but dozens of evil spirits, possibly inserted through witchcraft. But these weren't quiet, private affairs. These were public ceremonies, held in the throne room, with nobles, officials, and foreign ambassadors forced to watch as their king thrashed on the floor, writhing while priests screamed Latin incantations over him. Father Diaz would begin by forcing Charles to drink holy water, mixed with ground-up religious relics. Yes, actual crushed bone fragments from saints were mixed into the water. Unsurprisingly, Charles would immediately become violently ill. He would vomit, shake, collapse, and every time he lost consciousness, the priests would shout that it was proof the demons were fighting back. The more Charles suffered, the more convinced they became that the exorcisms were working. They'd press crucifixes into his skin until he cried out in pain, splash him with water, force him to repeat prayers in a language he barely understood. Charles didn't know Latin. but he tried, slurring words through his damaged mouth, his weak body struggling to keep up. And it didn't stop there. The priests began to believe that the entire palace was cursed. In 1698, they launched what can only be described as a spiritual purge. Servants were ordered to gather every object that might have been tainted: clothes, gifts, furniture, even personal items from dead queens, and burn them in massive bonfires. The courtyard filled with smoke and chanting, as flames devoured relics and memories alike. And Charles? He believed it was helping. His limited mental state made him easy to manipulate. When priests told him the demons were leaving, he felt relief. The pain would ease, even just a little. And that created a horrific cycle. Every time his symptoms flared up, Charles begged for another exorcism. The ceremonies became more frequent, more intense. In 1699, Father Diaz claimed to have expelled 47 demons, each one with its own name, and each blamed for a specific part of Charles's condition. That final exorcism was so intense that Charles collapsed afterward and didn't speak for 3 days. Think about that. While the court performed medieval rituals to drive out imaginary demons, the king was slowly dying from very real genetic and physiological collapse, and no one could stop it. 5. The autopsy that shocked Europe. Charles II finally died in 1700 at just 38 years old. By then, most of Europe had already written him off as cursed, a ghost of a king, pitied, feared, and whispered about. But no one, not even his harshest critics, was prepared for what doctors would find after his death. Because when the royal physicians opened up his body for autopsy, what they discovered was so grotesque, so deeply disturbing, that the official report was suppressed. It was considered too horrifying for public release, but the details leaked anyway. And they didn't just confirm the rumors, they went far beyond anything anyone had imagined. Dr. Jerónimo de la Fuente y Pierola, the royal physician who led the examination, wrote a report that became infamous across Europe. A report that didn't describe a man, but something closer to a failed biological experiment. Let's start with the heart. Dr. Pierola described it as no larger than a walnut, shriveled, blackened, and dried out like burnt meat. A healthy adult heart usually weighs around 300 grams. Charles's weighed less than 50. It was so small and so damaged that the doctors couldn't understand how he had circulated blood through his body at all. His lungs, corroded and gangrenous, filled with rotting fluid and diseased tissue. The smell when they opened his chest cavity was so foul that several assistants reportedly fled the room, gagging. His intestines were worse. They were described as putrefied, essentially decomposing while he was still alive. Parts of them had turned black and gelatinous. His reproductive organs, the ones that had been the subject of so much royal scrutiny, were catastrophically underdeveloped, almost childlike. But the most shocking discovery came when they opened his skull. Inside, they found an abnormal amount of fluid surrounding his brain, what we now know as hydrocephalus. His brain tissue was discolored, soft, and malformed. Portions of it appeared to have never fully developed. This explained so much: his delayed learning, his emotional instability, his constant confusion and pain. His brain had been fundamentally broken from birth. Dr. Pierola's final verdict was blunt and devastating. It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ. Let that sink in. Not one. Not his heart. Not his lungs. Not his brain. Not even his stomach or intestines. Every part of Charles II, every vital organ, was diseased, deformed, or dying. The man had been a walking corpse for years, and somehow he had lived to 38. The irony was staggering. A royal court that had spent decades blaming witches and demons finally had its answer, and it wasn't supernatural at all. It was genetics. The Habsburgs had played with human heredity like it was a political strategy. For 200 years, they arranged marriages like chess moves, always keeping power in the family. But biology isn't a game, and in the end, their obsession with purity had created a king so biologically broken, his very existence defied science. Charles wasn't cursed by magic. He was cursed by his family's ambition. 6. The war he couldn't stop. When Charles II died, he left no heir, no son, no daughter, no one to sit on the Spanish throne. And that was the spark. Europe exploded into war, the War of the Spanish Succession. France, Austria, Britain, the Dutch Republic, Prussia, every major power scrambled for a piece of the crumbling Spanish Empire. The war would last 13 years. It would kill more than 500,000 people. All because one man, the final product of 2 centuries of royal inbreeding, was too genetically damaged to continue his dynasty. Charles never commanded armies, never changed the map of Europe. He didn't build monuments or launch empires, but his absence changed everything. His death created a vacuum that sucked the entire continent into chaos. A king who never truly lived became the reason hundreds of thousands died. The final tragedy. What makes Charles's story so haunting is that none of it was his fault. He didn't ask to be born into a family that treated marriage like a science experiment. He didn't choose his malformed body, his limited mind, or his life of constant pain. He was the inevitable result of generations of powerful people who believed they were above the laws of nature. And nature pushed back. Charles II became a living warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition ignores biology, when tradition outweighs compassion, and when the people in power prioritize bloodlines over basic humanity. And in the end, that's the real horror of Charles's story. Not the exorcisms, not the autopsy, not the war, but the quiet truth that a boy was born broken, and the world never gave him a chance to be anything else. If you found this story as chilling and tragic as I did, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history's darkest corners. And let me know in the comments, which disturbing royal mystery should I investigate next?